next on The American Experience. In World War II, Mexican Americans won more medals of honor than any other ethnic group in this country. But their biggest battle lasted for 50 years in the copper mines of Arizona.
You can push people just so far, and somebody's going to squawk about it. We were right, and they were wrong, and they knew it.
Los Mineros, next on The American Experience. Major funding for this series is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the financial support of viewers like you.
Corporate funding for the American Experience is provided by Aetna. For more than 135 years, a part of the American Experience.
Hello, I'm David McCullough. Welcome to the American Experience. 3.5 hours east of Phoenix on Route 666 in southeastern Arizona are two small towns few people have heard of, Clifton and Morenci, or Clifton-Morenci, since they're nearly side by side. You have to go by car. There's no airport, no train stop. Just as there's no book that tells the story you're about to see, no biographies of the hard, determined faces that look out of old photographs taken there at the turn of the century, when our story begins. Clifton-Morenci is copper country, and the men who mined the copper, a force of thousands, were mostly Mexican Americans. They were desirable because they worked cheap. They did the dirtiest jobs, Mexican work, and were thought to be easy to handle. That they were dark-eyed, dark-skinned, and Catholics also made them easy targets for abuse. They were segregated, discriminated against, locked out of white labor unions. The governor of Arizona, in an effort to explain why literacy in English was so low among them, noted sympathetically that they were so poor they couldn't clothe their children suitably for the classroom. They thought of themselves as true Americans, and in their struggle, they more than proved it. Los Mineros, the miners.
This is a story of men who came to work in a foreign land. A story that has never been told.
Nos traían de México para trabajar las minas de cobre allá en Arizona.
They brought us from Mexico to work the copper mines of Arizona.
Pensando que como humanos nos querían.
We thought they saw us as human beings,
Mas solo querían nuestro sudor y labor.
but they only wanted our sweat and labor.
Pasaron los años 50 lo menos.
For 50 years we fought, and in the end, we triumphed.
Lo que tanto peleamos. Para que nos trataran como seres humanos.
This is the story of the Battle of Los Mineros.
De los mineros.
Clifton, Morenci, Arizona. There's little left to remind us of the fortunes that were made and lost in these hills. Copper made this one of the richest mining districts in the United States. Thousands of Mexican workers came here. They were promised jobs and good wages. Among the first to arrive was the father of David Velasquez. He left Mexico with a few bags and a contractor's words of great opportunity still echoing in his head.
My father came over to Morenci in about 1906, and he used to live in Chihuahua. Apparently the American companies knew that the people from Chihuahua were experienced miners, so they used to send their people out there and recruit. And they come over what they used to call renganches. In other words, they recruit a bunch of people, men especially, and bring them over all together.
Most of the Mineros came from the northern Mexican states of Sonora and Chihuahua, where they had been miners for generations. They were brought to a small mining district in eastern Arizona. Within a few years, Clifton, Morenci grew from 200 to 10,000. The mining boom was sparked by America's enormous appetite for copper. With the arrival of electricity, copper was needed for telephone lines, telegraph service, and power plants. Newcomers from all over came to work in Morenci. They shared one thing in common: the business of getting copper out of the ground. Using candles for light, the miners spent 12 hours a day underground. They worked 4,000 feet below the surface in a maze of tunnels 100 miles long. The shafts were supported only by wooden beams.
You can always hear the timber creaking, like in an old house. Of course, the first thing you did when you went into your working place was look for loose boulders, loose rock. And you put in timbers for as much room as you had. And you'd start drilling and just hope nothing fell on you.
Work areas were cramped. The air was thin. Temperatures would rise to 104 degrees. As experienced miners, the Mineros were accustomed to harsh conditions underground. What they weren't prepared for was the way they were treated simply because they were Mexican. Sylvester Maury, an early traveler to Arizona, wrote,
"My own experience has taught me that the lower class of Mexicans are docile, faithful, good servants. They have been peons for generations. It is their natural condition."
Mexicans were assigned the worst jobs in the mines, and the most dangerous. Anglo timbermen who built the wooden supports were paid $4 a day. Mexican timbermen received $2. Anglo muckers who shoveled the ore out of the mines were paid $1.50 a day. Mexican muckers were paid 70 cents. This dual-wage system persisted throughout the mining industry.
Nos trajeron porque podemos trabajar.
They brought us for our skills, and now they treat us worse than dogs.
Que no somos como ellos.
Because we are not like them, they forget we are men.
In those days, a lot of them suffered. They were the burros, the ones that did all the work in those mines. See what I mean? Those were the guys that were producing and dying in there.
The Minero not only faced hardship in the mines, but also in town, a company town, built chiefly by the Phelps Dodge Corporation. Like all such towns, the company owned and operated everything, from the waterworks to the hospital to the workers' homes. Miners bought their food and dry goods at the Phelps Dodge Mercantile Store, where markups of 200% were common. With a day's salary, a miner could only buy a dozen eggs and a pound of coffee.
It was hard on my father because he didn't know how to speak English. He didn't know how to add or subtract. I saw receipts from the grocery store where they would add them up. They didn't have an adding machine at that time. They add them up by hand. 6 and 6, 15. 1 and carry the 5. Always to the store advantage.
The Morenci Club was where company officials and their families spent their free time. Here they could play billiards, tennis, and bridge. The club was off limits to Mexicans, as were all Anglo establishments. Socializing between Anglos and Mexicans was strictly forbidden.
This one morning when I went to work, told me the mine superintendent wanted to see me. So I went over and he said, Avery, you had so-and-so up at your house last night. And I said, yeah. He said, you don't have Mexicans come to your house. And I said, well, goddamn, it's my house. I'll have anybody come to it I want. He said, no, you won't. He said, that's company house. And he said, you work for the company. Remember that.
Mexicans were forced to live in the most undesirable parts of town, usually along steep hillsides. In Morenci, the Mexican side of town was called Chihuahua Hill. Unlike Anglo neighborhoods, Mexican homes had no electricity or running water. Most houses were made from scrap wood supplied by the company.
In the hill where we used to live, they call it Chihuahuita, because there was a lot of people from Chihuahua. Most of those people had to build their own shacks, just get 1x12s, put them together, make a room and a roof, and cover them with a muslin. A lot of people, all they had was those powder boxes, wooden powder boxes they used as chairs. I remember that a lot of times we see people moving from one house to the other, and they always did it at night. And one time I asked my mother, she says, how come they always do it at night? Why don't they do it in daytime? He said, well, he says their furniture is so bad that they want to move at night when people won't see what they have.
A sense of community developed in Chihuahuita. Shut out by the Anglos, the Mineros started societies of their own, called mutualistas, or mutual aid societies.
Mutualistas were very important for Mexicans to combat racism. The Alianza Hispanoamericana, or La Liga Protectora, made it very clear that they were there to protect the rights of Mexicans, to speak out for the Mexican, to help him in any way that they could.
The mutualistas offered burial insurance and sponsored social events, and increasingly tried to deal with the hostile Anglo world. A report from the Department of Interior in 1908 stated,
"The Mexican laborer is unambitious, listless, physically weak, irregular, and indolent. His strongest point is his willingness to work for low wages."
As the mine owners aggressively recruited Mexican labor, Anglo workers were terrified their own jobs were in jeopardy because Mexicans worked for so little. The Anglos turned to a union, the Western Federation of Miners. The WFM decided the best way to protect Anglos was to drive the Mexicans out of the mines. The anti-Mexican campaign began with a devious plan. Anglos were paid by the day, the Mexicans by the hour. The union forced the copper companies to cut the workday from 10 hours to 8 hours. Overnight, the Mineros suffered a 20% cut in pay. On the morning of June 3rd, 1903, For the first time in Arizona history, over 1,000 Mexican workers went out on strike. The mining companies refused to negotiate. Abraham Salcido, a 26-year-old minero from Chihuahua, led the strike against the company, becoming a folk hero in the process.
Estos versos que yo canto se convierten en corrido.
The verses that I sing is a corrido to remember a hero whose name is Abraham Salcido.
Abraham Salcido vino a Clifton, Arizona.
He came to Clifton, Arizona
Ayudarle a sus paisanos
to help his countrymen earn an equal wage like the Americans.
sueldo como los americanos.
The Mineros armed themselves and took control of the mines, shutting down the smelters and mills. The governor asked the Mexican consul to come talk some sense to the Mexicans and ordered 300 Arizona Rangers to the scene. "2,000 miners marched in solidarity through the town, openly taunting the Rangers. The governor cabled President Roosevelt asking for cavalry support.
Comenzaron la discordia, les llegó una tempestad.
At the height of the tension, a heavy thunderstorm broke. A massive flood swept over the city.
La ciudad.
When the flood hit the Mexican side of town, 50 people were killed instantly. Most of their homes were destroyed. The next day, federal troops disarmed the strikers and placed the community under martial law. Ten of the strike leaders were arrested, including Abraham Salcido. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison for inciting a riot. Within 2 weeks, the strikers were back at work. The strike had failed. The dual wage system was still in place. The Mineros had lost the opening skirmish, but the battle was far from over.
Every day, people was getting hurt underground mining. A lot of times, people will blow up working with the dynamite. And sometimes, the tunnels where they're working will cave in. Almost every day, they used to bring out somebody with a broken leg, broken arm, broken something, neck or something like that. Every day used to happen that.
A lot of them got cut by those motor cars they had in there that pulled those little old cars. Sometimes it was pretty dark in there, you know, with the dust and fumes in there, and these guys couldn't see those motor cars coming, and I saw a lot of them die.
There was not too much protection for the workers. They did most of the drilling dry. They didn't have respirators. The only thing they could do was cover their face with a handkerchief.
Among the worst threats miners faced was silicosis, known as miner's consumption. 1 out of every 3 miners got this deadly lung condition from years of breathing the mineral dust.
My father, after putting about 22 years underground, he could barely breathe.
He coughs day and night because his lungs are full of that dust, you know. Can't get it out of there no more. They cough day and night, and And every time they cough, they throw out small pieces of lungs until the lungs disappear and they die. It's painful.
I remember when my father died, we took him by horse buggy from here down to the depot. Any worker that died, that worked for the company at that time, the company would furnish the train. They would take him by train to the cemetery. And they used to call it the Catholic cemetery because all the Chicanos were Catholics. They wouldn't want to call it the Mexican cemetery, so they just call it the Catholic cemetery.
"40 miles south of the U.S. border was a mining empire in Cananea, Mexico. An American, Colonel William Greene, owned the Cananea Copper Company. Mexican President Porfirio Diaz had enticed foreign industrialists to take advantage of Mexico's rich natural resources. By 1906, Cananea looked more like a company town in Arizona than a Mexican pueblo. The town's most prominent structure was not the Catholic Church, but Colonel Greene's two-story clapboard mansion. The Mineros suffered the same conditions as their countrymen north of the border. They endured segregated housing, lack of promotion, and even in Mexico, a dual-wage system.
The Americans were paid the number 3 in dollars, and the Mexicans were paid 3 pesos. The rate of exchange was 2 to 1, so automatically Americans for the same type of work got paid twice as much.
Outraged by this oppressive treatment of their fellow countrymen, Mexican intellectuals and political activists began to organize. Cananea became a symbol of foreign tyranny.
Señores Mineros, teach the American you are not beasts of burden. The American who has displaced us with his legion of blue-eyed blondes, Esteban Calderon.
My father was a baker, and he owned a bakery there in Cananea. But yet he was one of those liberal types, and I guess he liked to play politics. He would sympathize with the miners of the conditions that they were subject. So over here, there was a little place called Ori Plata, where they used to plan their tragedies.
Abraham Salcido was released from prison in Arizona in the spring of 1906. He went directly to Cananea to join the labor organizers working in the mines. On June 2nd, that same year, the Mineros went out on strike. They gathered to present their demands to company officials.
Colonel Greene personally came out and talked to the miners and told them that he wanted to raise their salaries, but that the President of Mexico wouldn't allow it, that he was asking them as a friend to go back to work.
The strikers refused. Dressed in their Sunday best, they marched through the camp to gather supporters. Over 2,500 arrived at the company's lumber yard, run by 2 Americans, George and Will Metcalf. George had been warned the strikers were coming.
The first thing that the 2 Metcalf brothers did inside of the lumberyard was to turn on the hoses that they had in case of a fire, and they trained it on the crowd. This infuriated the miners, so they forced the doors open. The 2 Metcalf brothers shot, apparently first into the air and then directly into the crowd, killing 2 or 3 of the miners. The miners set fire to the office of the lumberyard to smoke the 2 Metcalf brothers out. They came out still shooting, and the miners killed them both. One of them was apparently killed with his own rifle, and the other one was clubbed to death and stuck to death with miners' candlesticks that they were still carrying during the march that they had. Once they had killed the two Metcalf brothers, the miners were met by a group of about 30 armed Americans headed by Green, and the shooting began again.
By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Mexican troops arrived to put down the strike. They were joined by 270 Arizona Rangers who had been armed at the Phelps Dodge Mercantile store. The Rangers had violated Mexican law in crossing the border with arms. To avoid an international incident, they were hastily deputized by the Mexican state governor. By the next day, the strike had been put down. Once again, Abran Salcido and the other strike leaders were jailed for inciting a riot.
My father was arrested and sent to prison. They never could prove anything. So he came to the United States and he says, I've had enough of that thing in Mexico.
23 people lost their lives at Cananea, 17 of them Mexican. The strike had failed. None of the strikers' demands was met. But the Cananea strike would give birth to the first major revolution of the 20th century, the Mexican Revolution. In the end, Porfirio Diaz would be in exile, and 1 million of his countrymen would lay dead.